Trump lost in court, and at first glance that sounds like the moment everything changed, the moment Canada could finally breathe, the moment the trade war began to unwind. But that is not what actually happened. And this is exactly where the real story begins, because the most dangerous weapon in Trump's Canada strategy was never just the tariff itself. It was the uncertainty built around it, the message sent to companies, investors, automakers, suppliers, refineries, and workers that north. American trade could be disrupted at any moment, and once that message is embedded into the system, a court ruling does not simply erase it. That is the part most people miss, because headlines are built around visible victories and visible losses. And in February, the visible event was huge. The U.S. Supreme Court struck down Trump's sweeping tariffs imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which looked like a major legal defeat for the White House, and on paper it was. But on paper is not the same thing as in practice. And in practice, the tariffs that hurt Canada the most were not all swept away in one clean motion. The pressure on steel, aluminum, autos, and key industrial sectors did not suddenly disappear. The threat surrounding the USMCA review did not evaporate, and corporate planners did not wake up the next day thinking stability had returned. Now here is the problem. Most people still analyze this trade war as if it were a scoreboard. Trump imposes tariffs. Canada retaliates. Courts intervene. One side wins. One side loses. But that is too shallow, because what matters in a modern trade conflict is not only the tariff rate. It is whether companies believe the rules of the system will still exist 6 months from now, whether they believe a cross-border investment will remain viable, whether a factory expansion still makes sense, whether supply chains designed around seamless North American integration can survive repeated political shocks. And that is why Trump's real leverage was always larger than the specific tariff line written on a customs sheet. Look at the sequence. In early March, Canada and the United States resumed high-level trade talks for the first time in months, with Dominic LeBlanc meeting U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer. And that alone tells you the court ruling did not settle the matter. Because if the system had truly stabilized, there would be no need for such intense political management. But the talks resumed. Precisely because the deeper issue remained unresolved, the North American trade architecture was still under pressure, and both sides knew that the summer review of the USMCA was approaching under a cloud of mistrust, threat, and strategic repositioning. And this is where the obvious reading starts to collapse, because many people assume Canada's main problem was legal exposure to Trump's broad tariffs. But Canada's bigger problem was strategic exposure to American unpredictability, and those are not the same thing. A legal exposure can be challenged in court. A strategic exposure lives inside every boardroom decision, every logistics contract, every sourcing plan, every hiring freeze, every delayed expansion, every supplier that begins quietly asking whether dependence on a single American political cycle has become too expensive to justify. That is especially true in autos, because the North American auto industry is not a set of isolated national factories. It is one deeply integrated production machine. Parts cross borders multiple times. Margins depend on timing, scale, and predictability, and once tariff threats re-enter the system, once the possibility of fresh disruption becomes credible, the damage is no longer theoretical. It starts affecting orders, investment planning, location strategy, and labor confidence. Brookings has been warning that new costs and new uncertainty are now central facts of the 2026 USMCA environment. And reports from both Canadian and American outlets show that suppliers have already been hit by order reductions, pressure, and growing instability, which means Trump's court loss did not neutralize the industrial consequences already in motion. And this matters because trade wars are rarely paid for where politicians say they will be paid for. They are paid in second-order effects. Delayed projects, more expensive financing, lower confidence, risk premiums, and fragmented sourcing. And once that happens, the cost spreads quietly. It does not always show up as a dramatic headline. Sometimes it shows up as the factory that is not expanded, the supplier that shifts production, the investment committee that chooses caution. The buyer who now assumes cross-border exposure is a structural liability rather than a competitive advantage. Meanwhile, Trump's own strategic position is more complicated than it first appears, because his trade pressure was supposed to project strength, extract concessions, and make the United States look like the indispensable center of the North American system. But the deeper problem is that repeated tariff shocks can also teach neighbors and allies a dangerous lesson, that dependence on Washington is itself a risk variable. And once countries begin internalizing that lesson, American leverage becomes harder to use cleanly. In other words, even when Trump succeeds in creating pressure, he may also be training Canada to search for insulation, redundancy, and alternative bargaining power. That is why the real weapon was never just tariffs. The real weapon was uncertainty as policy, uncertainty as leverage, uncertainty as a permanent tax on continental integration. And the reason this matters so much for Canada is that Canada cannot instantly replace the U.S. market, but it does not need to replace it overnight for the strategic equation to change. It only needs enough alternative leverage, enough diversification in energy, enough external partnerships, enough proof that America is no longer the only stable destination for its long-term economic future. And once that process begins, even slowly, the relationship changes, because the weaker actor is no longer only reacting, it is adapting. Energy is a perfect example of this hidden shift, because while Trump has often framed the relationship in blunt nationalist terms, experts in Canada have pushed back on the claim that the United States does not need Canadian supply. And the numbers around energy interdependence make that argument hard to dismiss. Reuters reported in late March that the Trump administration was discussing permitting connected to a proposed partial Keystone XL revival. And the underlying reason is simple. The United States may be a massive producer, but it is also a massive consumer, and Canadian supply remains strategically relevant. At the same time, Bloomberg reported that Canada is pushing to move more gas into U.S. Gulf Coast LNG export channels, which shows the relationship is not a clean story of separation. It is a story of contested dependence, and that is exactly what makes Trump's approach so risky. Because if your strategy depends on convincing everyone that America holds all the cards, then every demonstration of mutual dependence becomes politically inconvenient. Every reminder that Canadian crude, Canadian gas, Canadian minerals, and Canadian industrial links still matter becomes evidence that brute force pressure has limits, and once those limits become visible, the image of total leverage begins to crack. That does not mean Canada has suddenly won, and this is critical. It means the battle moved from the headline tariff to the structure underneath, from the courtroom defeat to the industrial aftershock, from the legal weapon to the psychological and strategic one. Now, at first glance, Trump can still claim that pressure works, because Canada has not escaped the system. It is still tied to American demand, still vulnerable to U.S. political decisions, still forced into negotiations, still exposed to shocks in autos, metals, and energy. But the hidden part is that every round of pressure also makes the system less trustworthy, and that creates cost for the United States too, because American manufacturers, consumers, and energy players are not operating in a vacuum. They operate inside the same continental machine. If Canada begins hedging more aggressively, if companies begin redesigning supply chains with political risk at the center, if investment decisions start pricing in future trade whiplash, then America's own industrial ecosystem pays more for the very leverage Trump tried to weaponize. And this is why the court loss matters, even though it did not end the damage, because it exposed something deeper. It exposed that Trump's trade strategy had become so expansive that it ran into legal limits, but also so disruptive that even a legal correction could not fully restore confidence. And that is a dangerous place for any economic superpower to be. A strong system does not just impose pressure, it preserves credibility. And once credibility weakens, every future threat becomes more expensive to use, because markets, companies, and allies start adjusting before the next blow even lands. So the real issue is not whether Trump won or lost one legal battle. The real issue is whether he permanently changed how Canada and the wider North American industrial base think about American reliability, and the answer increasingly looks like yes. The resumed talks in March were not a return to normal. They were an attempt to manage abnormality. The auto sector's anxiety was not a side issue. It was a warning sign. The energy discussions were not proof of clean dominance. They were proof of unresolved interdependence. And the Supreme Court ruling was not the end of the story. It was the moment the deeper mechanism became easier to see. What most people miss is that tariffs are dramatic. But uncertainty is durable. Tariffs can be challenged, delayed, modified, or struck down. But uncertainty sits in the system long after the court opinion is published. It reshapes decisions quietly, and once enough quiet decisions accumulate, the structure changes. That is the part that could matter most over the next year, especially as the USMCA review approaches, because this is no longer just about a tariff dispute. It is about whether North America can still function as a coherent production bloc under political conditions where one side repeatedly uses volatility as a negotiating tool. And if the answer is no, or even not reliably, then the cost is bigger than the headline ever suggested, because then the real casualty is not one tariff line or one court case. It is the confidence that made the continent economically powerful in the first place. That confidence is what allowed plants to be built, components to move, investment to scale, energy to flow, and strategy to look continental rather than defensive. And once that confidence starts breaking down, everybody pays more. The weaker actor, the stronger actor, and the industries that sit in between. So yes, Trump lost in court, but Canada did not really walk free. Because the real weapon was never just tariffs, it was the permanent pressure created around trade, law, industry, and dependence. And that is why this story is bigger than it looks. It is not about one ruling. It is about a system that may have learned to fear instability more than tariffs themselves. And once that happens, the next stage of the conflict is no longer only legal, it is structural. The question now is not whether Trump can still impose pressure. The question is whether that pressure is slowly making North America weaker on both sides of the border, and whether Canada, by being forced to adapt, may ultimately come out of this more insulated than Washington ever intended. So when you look at this trade war, do not ask only who won the case. Ask who changed the system, because that is where the real bill may come due.